They always have guests at functions like this, but they almost never have the guest, and we do. I'd like to introduce Val Guest, who directed this picture.
Hello. Did I do that?
Does it bring back memories?
Yes, it certainly does. I haven't seen that for 100 years. It does bring back a lot of memories, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the transition from this being a BBC teleplay, which I guess was quite popular with Stanley Baker, which I think they did twice on 2 successive weekends, and the idea of translating this to, of course, you had already done that with the other 2 Quatermass.
With the other 2, yes, but it was a little different because Michael Carreras called me up about this, and he said they had a new producer working for them, Aubrey Baring. And did I see the television thing? And I said, no, I didn't. I was very ignorant in those days about television. And they said, well, it's a good story, read it, and if you'd like to do it, let's all get together and do it. That's how that happened. And Tom Neal, Nigel Neal, he had written a script, which was a very, very good script, but would have been gone with the wind because it was about 3 hours long. And we had to whittle it down very carefully without losing all his... I only had a lot of very good thoughts in there. He's a very good writer. So that's how...
That's probably the only intelligent movie that I can think of that's ever been made on this particular subject.
Oh, well, that's nice to hear. That had something to do with that. That's all. It's nice. And the fact that you invite me here somewhere near Halloween, I'm not taking that as anything personal. We had a lot of, we enjoyed making it. It was a tough picture. Although you may not believe it, not one single actor went out into the snow. I was the only one who went out in the snow. And we went to a little place up in the French Pyrenees called Le Mongy, which was actually a skiing resort. And from there, we went up to the highest observatory in the world called the Pic du Midi. And we would have to go up in cable car every morning. And before they would allow us in the cable car, it was about 6 o'clock in the morning, they used to run the cable car up to break the ice on the cable. So you can imagine how we felt about this. And in going up in this car, after they said it's now okay for you to do it, we used to go up in the car and we used to hear pieces of ice dropping on the roof. But after about a week of that, we didn't take any notice of it at all, so you can get used to everything. But we spent several weeks out there shooting with doubles, and I must tell you that the most difficult thing in the world that I've ever had to do was to direct those doubles to do what I thought Peter Cushing would do, and Robert Brown would do, and Forrest Tucker would do. So you had to do it in reverse. You had to direct the doubles as to how you thought the others would do it, and then tell the real people later when we shot the interiors at Pinewood Studios to try and copy the doubles. Very difficult to do that. You only if you have wonderful actors are you able to do that.
Did you plan out a lot of it with storyboards? And
everything. Every film I've ever made, I always have a storyboard up on the set so that everybody knows where we are. And when the problems arise, as eventually they always do, I can look at the board and say, right, well, we can do this instead. That's a great help. And I mean, I'm not blessed with being able to go on the set and have instant genius. It'd be lovely if you could do that, or if you had the time to do that, and the money. But no, we plan it all out like a battle, actually. It's like war plans.
Especially when you're dealing with a studio. I noticed that a lot of your films are in CinemaScope. Espresso Bongo, which was a very big critical success in 1960 with...
which they're about to remake.
Oh, really?
Yes, we made that with our own company, and we've sold the rewrite the remake rights to a company in London, and it's shortly to go into sort of pre-script stages. Bringing it up.
And The Day the Earth Caught Fire, which is also being remade.
Day the Earth Caught Fire, yes, is in pre-production at 20th Century Fox here.
What's it like to watch your work being reimagined?
Well, it's great because I had on Day the Earth Caught Fire, I've been working on updating script and things, so I've had a part of that. It's very flattering to know that three of my films are sort of in various stages of being about to be remade. Day the Earth Caught Fire with Fox, and Warner's are chatting around a thing of redoing Quatermass Experiment, which was creeping unknown here, and calling it Experiment, and Espresso Bongo in London. So that's rather nice.
I knew I had a thought here. And other pictures I was thinking of, Yesterday's Enemy and 80,000 Suspects and Contest Girl, all of which are in widescreen. Do you have a particular affinity to?
No, there was a time when if it was important that you should do it in widescreen. When somebody discovered the first widescreen, everybody jumped on the bandwagon. I think what we did this was called Hammerscope.
Yes, and only in the American prints they called it
Dialoscope. In fact, whichever company you work with called Scope their name, you know. I mean, if I worked for Renowned Pictures a couple of times, and they called it Renowned Scope. So it all became Scope, and everybody had to have the letterbox thing, and then it was the thing that you did. Nobody thought ahead what's going to happen when television gets going with films. Nobody thought of that at all.
You see half the movie.
Well, it does, because I've seen Bongo on television when nobody's done anything about reconverting it to normal.
You see noses.
And there's an awful lot of the cast aren't on the screen at all. Lefts and rights go. But on this particular picture, we had a great bunch of people. I mean, Peter Cushing, I don't have to talk about Peter Cushing to you. And he's a wonderful character to have on a movie, because Peter is not at all what you would expect him to be. He has an enormous sense of fun. And at the end of some of these very dramatic scenes he was playing in then, if I said, cut, fine, that's print, he would suddenly go into doing a jig dance and singing Knees Up Mother Brown and things, you know. He also...
Big Warner Brothers cartoon fan, by the way.
It also might interest you to know that Peter was known as Props Cushing, because he always dreamt up props to use. And he would never tell anybody until it actually happened in the shot. I mean, in the scene with the Yeti tooth, which we rehearsed a normal amount of times, and he went through the whole thing and everything, comes the take, when we're taking it, and he suddenly brings a tape measure out and measures it. And everybody, I look at that scene and I can see Maureen Connell's lips just twitch a little bit. Richard Waters, nothing phases Dickie Waters, so he took it through. But that sort of thing is what Peter Cushing used to do in everything. You never knew what was going to happen. There was always some prop would come out. You'd take a nail file out and scratch it to see how hard it was, you know. So there was always moments like that. And he's a great person, too. Another thing you might not know about Peter Cushing is he became a Shakespearean actor before he went into all this. And he originally started up in London's Petticoat Lane, which is a market there with all the stalls selling everything. And he was a barrow boy. He used to work on one of the stalls. And he had a strong Cockney accent. No, you used to talk like that. And he met this wonderful woman who he married, who trained him, gave him elocution lessons, put him through a drama school, and he became Peter Cushing. And this is why when she died, he was so completely...
I noticed that this character is named Helen, too, as his wife. Yeah. I guess that was something he liked to do.
He was completely shattered.
Yeah. Well, what can you tell us about just Hammer Films in general as a place to work?
It was a wonderful place to work. It was like a family, you know. We all... I don't know. I think I did 13 films for Hammer over the years. I'm not all off, but coming back and doing another one and coming back again. It was like working with a family. Everybody knew everybody. In the little Bray studios that we used to work with in those early days, the local, in Bray Village, the local police sergeant's wife ran the canteen, the commissary there, and did all the home cooking. It was like being in a family.
Well, it wasn't really a studio, was it? It was a manor house, wasn't it? It was converted.
No, the manor house was next door, which we did for posh sets and things. But otherwise, it was a little house. And to get a long shot, you had to put your bottom in the fireplace, and use a wide-angle lens. And it taught us all an awful lot of things about making movies, because you had no money and you had no time. You just had to have instant genius. But it was wonderful. They were a wonderful gang to work with, and I loved the whole time there. I think anybody who worked at Hammer would say the same thing. And everybody knew their job and were learning. We were all learning fast the whole time. When I went away from Hammer, in between Hammer pictures, I went off and did other pictures and things. You noticed the difference in other studios, which were just a sort of a factory, a friendly factory. Whereas this was a little unit that worked on its own.
Anybody have any questions?
Yes. Just, all right, yeah.
I saw yesterday's Enemy on television recently, and I was kind of amazed at how rough the British character, the colonel played by Stanley Baker was.
Yeah.
I thought it gave a really kind of a unsympathetic or kind of a view of the British Army that I would think that the military in England wouldn't have been happy with. I was wondering if there was any problem when that movie originally came out.
No, none at all. Strangely enough, there wasn't at all. Because hopefully we did it with sincerity and not just to be sensational. It was based on an actual incident that happened in Burma in the British Army. And no, we didn't have any... in fact, we had very good reactions. We won a couple of awards with it. I mean, and that was in Britain, so nobody... And I'll tell you an interesting thing about that. We had a wonderful art director, Bernard Robinson, who did this. Bertie Robinson, wonderful art director. He built us a set at Pinewood Studios of jungles which were on revolving platforms. So all you had to do was revolve each side and you got another part of the jungle. So we did it all on one enormous stage and kept revolving bits of jungle. And it looks absolutely terrific. Of the Burma War was fought in all those jungles. And I remember at the premiere, they had a sort of a semi-royal premiere because they had Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Burma Army, Queen's cousin and everything, came to the premiere at the Empire in Leicester Square in London. And he sat next to me during the screening. And when all the stuff was going on in the jungles and everything, he said, "I know that. Now, where is that? I know that part of the jungle. I know it." And I said, "Oh, well, it's I can't tell you, and we went on with the film. But it absolutely convinced him, and he was the head of the whole army. But he didn't worry about there being that character, which was a very good character, and Stanley Baker was terrific in it.
One other thing, there's another film that you did, it's called Full Treatment in England, Stop Me Before I Kill.
Yeah.
And I saw it on television when I was, a child, and I haven't seen it on television or anywhere in years.
And you won't see it here either because we couldn't get it.
Is that a lost film?
I don't know. I haven't seen it over here. No, I've seen it on television over there. Yes.
Well, these films don't get lost; they just get misplaced by the studios. I mean, they have negatives on these things, as Michael Schlesinger was nice enough to print up a couple of pictures from the Columbia Library for us. But the negatives exist. It's just that it is expensive to make the prints, and this is probably the only place this print is going to be run, and it's quite an expensive deal, so there's a limit to what you can...
That was a Columbia picture, anyway.
Yeah.
That was Columbia. Yes, the back. Can you talk up a little?
Sorry. Enemy from Space, I think, is one of the best science fiction movies that was ever made, and certainly it's one of my favorites. And it has probably two of the most shocking scenes I'd ever seen as a child when I first saw the picture. I think the film was 1956 or 57. It has the one scene with the pipes that were apparently plugged with what one character calls human pulp, and which was, as a kid, I remember I was shocked by the concept. It was also a Nigel Neal screenplay. But the other scene, and probably the most famous of all, is when a character played by, I think, Tom Shadow has fallen apparently into a vat of molecular acid alien fluid, and you see him as he's coming down the side of a petroleum storage building.
Yes.
Streaking his body, what's left of his body, along the side of the building, and then when Brian Donlevy comes to help him, he says, "Don't touch me, don't touch me." Was that scene, at the time, I'm sure that must have been very shocking, but can you give me a little bit of the background as to how you shot the scene and how it was...
Well, what I can tell you is that we shot that down at the Shell oil refinery, which was on the coast down in England, somewhere around. And I can only tell you that poor Tom Chatto had to do that 5 times. And it took him 6 months before he would talk to me again, but it wasn't our fault or my fault. It was the camera jammed, or the sound didn't get it, or one of the 100 things that can happen. But it was quite a scene, that, and we really did have to... I can't remember the stuff that the makeup department put on them, but it wasn't very nice. And when Tom Chatto said, "Don't touch me," he meant it.
What was the reaction to the film at the time? Were people shocked by it? I mean, were they taken by any of that?
I'm sorry, was what?
Were people shocked by that film, by what you depicted? Because there aren't any other films I know of that have a man covered with acid sliding down the side of a building.
Not guilty.
But it was effective. Was there any reaction of the general public at the time?
No, it was a success, the film, but I think some people went ooh, but I don't. But,
And if it weren't for that white supremacist, we'd be running it today.
No.
He's obviously collecting movies that only star white people.
There's a program up there.
What scenes did you direct in Casino Royale, and how did you like the film?
Casino Royale took a year out of my life, and there's a complete film to be made about the making of Casino Royale. What happened is that we had a mad producer called Charles Feldman, and he was a person who one day you wanted to cuddle, the next day you wanted to throttle. He called me and said, I want to do a James Bond film, and I want to have 18 stars playing James Bond, and I want a compendium of directors, half a dozen directors, to direct various sequences. And he asked me if I would string together an outline that we could work from to start off with on that. That's how that started. And they gave me, I think there were 4 scripts that had been written. One by, of all people, Ben Hecht. Another one by Terry Southern. Another one by Wolf Mankiewicz. And I can't remember who the 4th one is. And they were all written in entirely different styles. Of the only Bond book that wasn't owned by Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman. The only book they hadn't bought was Casino Royale, and they had pillaged everything in Casino Royale book for their other Bond films. So the only thing that Charlie Feldman had on this was the title. And even the Baccarat game in it had been stolen from one of the other Bond films, so everything had to be changed. And so none of these scripts really helped very much. So they then started to get... Charlie Feldman said, would I open it up and close it up, the film? Stupidly, I said yes. So I did the end sequence with Woody Allen. Woody and I sort of wrote that between us, just sitting up at night doing this thing. And the link scenes, because they had to have link scenes, but the link scenes weren't written until all the sections were done. And the chaos of that production was such that directors were dropping like flies, or being fired or something or other. And so it ended up that there were... Ken Hughes was on it. Ken did his sequence and then left. Peter Sellers had asked for another director to come in and direct him, had a fight on the first week and had him fired. And gradually we were being whittled down, and there was John Huston and myself and Robert Parrish, who was brought in to take over from the guy who had been fired. So we ended up with three of us. Robert Parrish finally did his piece and went back to Hollywood. The picture was nowhere near finished because Peter Sellers was in his manic depressive stages, and so you never knew whether he was going to turn up or crucify someone or whatever, you know. So he was being difficult, and he'd gone off to Spain on holiday. Before he went, Orson Welles wouldn't talk to Peter Sellers wouldn't talk to Orson Welles, and the main scene in the casino was the two of them playing a game together, so you can imagine that was very difficult, shooting over double shoulders for each thing. And it ended up finally with John Huston and myself, and Charlie Feldman changing his mind the whole time about this scene. He didn't like that set, wrong color, changed the color, which meant that every woman's dress had to be changed too. So it cost a fortune. And he would call me up and say, what set are you on next Tuesday? Because we can get William Holden. Write him in. And that's how it happened. And all sorts of people were written in. I mean, we had everybody written in, I think. And finally, Charlie Feldman... then the day came when John came to me and said, I'm fed up with this, I'm going to Ireland to play bloody poker. And he left. Oh, he said, you whatever's left, you'll do it for me, won't you do it for me? So Charlie Feldman then said to me, well, how are we going to put all this together? And I said, well, you need some link scenes to start with. So he said, well, write them. So I said, well, I'll only do this if you let me have some chums in it, otherwise I'm going to go round the bend. So I said, I will write link scenes with David Niven and Ursula Andress, and they will come right through the picture, and they'll keep me sane. So he said, all right. So that's how those were done, and they were linked right through. And in the end, Charlie Feldman said, he said, you've done so much on this, I'm going to give you a credit to yourself, coordinating director. And I said, if you do that, I'll sue you. People are going to look and say, this was coordinated? So it was a madhouse. It really was a madhouse. But I must say that it finally ended up making money. Anyway, the Columbia people know all about that. That was theirs. So...
I think one of the endearing qualities about these films is the seriousness with which Hammer horror, fantasy, science fiction films took the genre. Now, when you were making these films, when you were making your Yeti movie, did you take it as seriously as you would approach, say, a straight drama?
Well,
did the actors?
That's a very good question, because I'll tell you something, that when, and this is a little inside thing, Yolande, my wife, and I were going on holiday to Tangier, of all places, and Tony Hines said, there's a television series called the Quatermass Experiment, and we're thinking of making a movie of it. Will you take it away? It's a science fiction thing and everything. Take it away and read it. So he met us at the airport with a pile of these television scripts, which I needed, like a hole in the head of, excess baggage of these scripts. Anyway, we took them to Tangier, and I put them by the side of the bed. And they were there for a couple of weeks, I think, while we were there on holiday. And Yolande looked at them one day and said, "What's this?" And I said, "Oh, it's some story that Tony Hines wanted me to read." She said, "Well, have you read it?" So I said, No. It's all science fiction. It's not my cup of tea and everything." She said, "What do you mean it's not your cup? Since when have you been ethereal?" So I said, "All right, I'll read it." And I read it, and I was absolutely hooked. And so when I came back and talked to Tony Hines, I said, "Yes, I would love to do this, but I would like to do it one way only, and that is to do it factually, as though a company had said to me, go out and cover this. Go and cover it for 60 minutes or something. Cover the story." And so Tony Hines said, "Yes, fine." And always when you have a story of that kind, I always think it's, from my point of view, imperative that you take it seriously. And I said to everybody on the thing, believe every minute of this and it'll come across. So I shot it in many cases with handheld cameras and newsreel quality. And I did that with all the ones those kind that I did for Hammer, and even the police pictures that I made, that Hell is a City, and also Yesterday's Enemy thing. I tried to do it with a newsreel quality, a cinema verite sort of thing.
Those two pictures are available, not here, unfortunately, but they are on Laserdisc. And although I think to see The Creeping Unknown, you have to buy 3 other pictures. And it is run occasionally on TNT, but it's been extremely difficult to find a 35 print of it.
Sure.
Have you ever offered a horror film? I mean, you directed a lot of movies, a lot of films for Hammer, but never a Gothic film.
No, never. No, I never have. In fact, people say to me, "Oh, you did a lot of horror films, don't you?" And I said, "No, I didn't. I mean, I don't look on Quatermass or Creeping Unknown. I have to get these titles straight. I don't look on that as a horror. I look on that as a science fiction or a science faction, But and I certainly don't look on the other one, Enemies from Space, either as a horror film at all. A thriller maybe, but with fantasy as well. No, nobody ever asked me to do a Gothic film. I'll tell you an interesting thing about horror, because some people, I was never into even thinking about that kind of a picture. I would have got a great kick maybe out of making it. But the number of people who love those sort of things, if you go back, you will find that Jules Verne, who wrote almost things into the future, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and all that, was a mad fan of Edgar Allan Poe. And he was dying to write a horror. And he wrote a thing called The Carpathian Castle, which is his only horror. The rest is all things. And Hitchcock was always wanting to do an out-and-out horror. Always. That was the one thing that he wanted to do that he never got to do. He wanted to do a horror movie. Out-horror them all, he said.
The dinosaurs rule the earth. I couldn't really get into that.
Neither could I. Not my favorite movie.
No. Now, there are some tickets yet unsold. I wouldn't...
Oh, no, you'll love it. You'll love it. That's the only Hammer film that I didn't have fun making. And I think it's probably because we had an entirely different front of the house. We had different production office people, different everything. So, anyway.
Last question.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how the level of professionalism in the Hammer product compared with similar budgets and similar product in the U.S. at that time?
That would be very difficult for me to answer because I'm not all that up in the budgets and things of the horrors over here. But I know that in Hammer you had very little money in the early days and very little time because the budget was money and it went up and up and up. And so you really had to plan ahead of time. and you really had to conserve all your energies and really know what you were doing the night before. You had to really be ready for it. I don't know what happened with the American horrors, because I don't know what their budgets were.
Well, on that low-budget note, it's somehow appropriate, I'd like to thank Val for, he's, I think, one of the best directors who ever worked at Hammer.
Thank you. That's very kind.
And thanks.
Doors ruled
Of scores for numerous Hammer films, a very talented man who did some great music, Mr. James Bernard.
In the fact that they left me alone to do what I wanted with the music director, who was John Hollingsworth in the early days, and in later days Philip Martell. And the director who I got on very well with, and I only did one film with him, was Joseph Losey. And he was the director who, of the directors I can think of, after all, I didn't work with a great many of them, he was the one who took most interest personally in the music. I remember he was living in London at the time, and I remember going to see him and sort of having to sort of intellectualize about my ideas. And I really don't intellectualize about my ideas. If I've got to do a score for a film, the main thing that is worrying me is the time element. And if I was lucky, I got 4 weeks. Or I might have occasionally got a little bit more, sometimes less. So it was panic stations from the beginning. And so, one hadn't time to think, now what sort of score do I do? You just had to do a score and hope that the muse would come to one and give one some inspiration.
Well, your score for These Are the Damned is one of your best scores.
Oh, thank you.
Sounds better than this. Actually, you don't actually have to use these.
Oh, we don't.
I think they can. How long would an actual scoring session be?
How do you mean?
Well, when you actually get the orchestra together and you have, how much time did you have to? Did you get to do more than one take? Did you?
Well, they were always working against time. Can you hear all right? Good. I beg your pardon? Oh, right.
You want to hear the feedback?
How is
He's
that?
the only one.
How is that? All right. Yes. Well, it was 4 weeks was. You were fortunate to get 4 weeks. I think on She I had 5 weeks, and so we would say there might be, shall we say, 45 minutes music in the movie, might be 50, and I don't know if the rules are the same here, but the rules in England are that you can record up to 20 minutes music in 1 3-hour session, and that is working very hard, so you haven't time really to go back very much, because you might have, say, for the 45 or 50 minutes, you might have 3 sessions booked with an hour's overtime if you need it. And therefore, we always had to have, and I'm sure you still always still do have to have, absolutely top orchestral players who are very good sight readers, who can come in and see a score, which is often quite a difficult score, because a lot of my stuff for those type of films had to be rather discordant and not in any particular key. I loved it when I had a chance to do a love theme or something. I always grasped at those moments. But so it had to be a very good orchestra who could come in, see the music, read it through, and get it right, if not first time, certainly the second time, and then start to do the takes. And it was up to me to have done my maths extremely well. Fortunately, I can do simple maths, and I could work out exactly, if I decided a particular section of music was, say, going to be played at 100 beats a minute, I could work out exactly where the points of synchronization would come. So that if the conductor did his stuff and kept the orchestra playing at exactly 100 beats, I mean, you have to allow a little slowing or speeding up here and there, but if he could do that, all the synchronization points would sort of clock in on the dot.
When you would go through the film for the first time with John Hollingsworth, who else would be there? Would the editor, of course? And
the editor, obviously. The producers at Hammer, Anthony Hines, was always very helpful. He very much liked to be at the music breakdown sessions. well, you know, we do it reel by reel, stop after every reel and discuss where we're going to put the music and argue. And so there's the editor there and his poor assistant, and it's the assistant editor's job, or was in those days, to make notes of all our arguments and what we finally decided, and to make notes of exactly where in each reel we wanted to start the music and where we wanted to stop it. So they were there, the editor and his assistant, and then obviously the sound editor, because he would say, well, remember we are going to have a thunderstorm here, or howling of wolves, or whatever, you know. So one sort of had to work along with him. And that's how we did it, really.
Well, you know, in Hammer Films, music is actually a very important component, and people who've just seen Horror of Dracula will, I think, realize how much the music, which is a very exciting score, contributes to the movie. And in the case of other composers who have worked on this kind of film, notably I can think of Hans J. Salter, who did the Universal pictures. He wasn't really a big fan of the movies that he was writing music for, and would often be quoted as saying, "You should have seen these pictures before they put my music on them." And I wondered how. I mean, obviously some films are better than others, and it's quite apparent when you're looking at them which ones are going to be special and which ones are kind of routine. How does that affect? I always ask this of composers. How does this affect your approach to the movie?
Well, my approach was always, even if when I read, thought, oh, this is not very good, and even when I first saw bits of the film, and I thought this isn't all that hot, I just had to get myself fully into it. That's the only way I can do it. So that by the time I'd started work, I thought it was the most wonderful film in the world, and because I had to get fully into each dramatic situation and really live it. And during the time of doing the film, I was absolutely in it and thought it was wonderful. And it was amazing after a number of years, because when those films were first made, as you probably know, they had terrible reviews from a lot of the English critics who were shocked by the blood and the gore. Only a few of them really sort of entered into it. And so it's amazing all these years later that these films have become so popular.
I think it's because a lot of them are actually very good.
Well, I'm so...
Some aren't, of course, but...
I have to tell you one thing about the music in The Stranglers of Bombay. My friends I'm staying with said, "What is the music in The Stranglers of Bombay?" And I said, "Well, honestly, I can't remember. I simply have no memory of it." And now I realize why, because there hardly is any music in The Stranglers of Bombay. Now I see why I didn't remember it.
Do you have any particular pictures that you can think of that you felt you really made a difference? You really contributed more than your usual share to making the film work?
I suppose there were some, yes. I imagine The Horror of Dracula was one. It seems to be a score which has always been sort of considered very effective.
Well, this is the score where the three syllables of Dracula become the actual theme, which is very clever and much imitated.
Yes, well, I did it quite a bit in order to give myself an idea for a sort of, like, as though it were the first line of a song. You take Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and it gives you a sort of little idea for a melodic outline. Not a very
I bet you never thought of that.
Not a very romantic song, I agree, but it often started me off.
What was your first assignment for Hammer?
It was the Quatermass Experiment, known here as The Creeping Unknown.
Yes, I'm afraid it is.
Yes. And you want to know how I came to do it?
Yeah, how did you happen to...
Well, I was longing to get into movies, but of course they all said, well, what have you done? It's the usual story, and you have to haven't done anything. But I had been doing scores for radio plays, because we have to go right back to the early 50s now. And television had hardly started up again in England after the end of World War II, and radio was the big thing that everybody listened to. Well, the BBC started a channel called the Third Programme. It still exists. It's now called Radio 3, and it's specialized in classical music and radio productions of classical plays and new plays. Might be Shakespeare, might be Marlowe, anything like that. And I did a number of scores for them. And the conductor of them was nearly always John Hollingsworth, who became the music director of Hammer Films. He was a very good friend of mine too. I'd met him in the war when he was in the Air Force and I was in the Air Force. And so I did a score for a play. It's a restoration horror play written by Webster, who I think he came a little bit after Shakespeare, if my dates are right. And he wrote a play, The Duchess of Malfi. I don't know if you know it, but it's a marvelous play. It's like a sort of horror play, because everybody ends up stabbed or poisoned or dead. I mean, really, the stage is littered with bodies by the end. And so I did a score for this, and it was an all-star cast. Peggy Ashcroft was the Duchess of Malfi, and Paul Schofield was in it, and it went down from there, all stars. And John Hollingsworth was conducting the music, and I said, what do you think we ought to use for this score? And he said, well, I think strings would be good, strings and percussion. So I said, yes, I quite agree. I think strings and percussion would be a very good thing to do. Now, he was also the conductor of the Royal Opera House Orchestra for the ballet. He was one of the two leading conductors of the Royal Ballet in those days. And he said, well, we'll use the strings from the Royal Opera House. So I did the score, and as I say, it is a sort of horror play, so it was a sort of horror score. And shortly after that was all done, and luckily they had got to actually taping the music by then, because at the beginning they didn't even tape the music. I mean, we did it live in the studio while the play was being broadcast. Anyway, we had a tape of this. Well, Anthony Hines was just producing the Quatermass Experiment at that time, and the score was going to be written by another composer. I think his name was John Hotchkiss, who was doing quite a lot at that time. I didn't know him myself. Suddenly, Anthony Hines rang up John Hollingsworth and said, we've got a problem. John Hotchkiss is ill. He can't do the score. We need the score very soon now. Do you have anything up your sleeve or any composer? So John loyally rushed off to Tony Hines with the tapes of my stuff for the Duchess of Malfi, played it to Tony, and Tony said, yes, I like that. Ask him to do it. And the fee was £100. And I was delighted, and that's how I started.
Any questions?
One of my favorite scores that you did, one of my favorite Hammer films is X the Unknown.
Thank you.
I don't know if you recall the way you juxtaposed the music and the sound effects. The main title, I believe, is just a lone bird call. And you also have the radioactive sounds that you work with interspersed with the music. And the music only comes up at certain select moments. Do you have any reflections on that movie?
You know, I don't. No, I'm sorry to be so boring and not to be able to give you a good succinct answer on that. But it's so long ago, and it was on TV the other night, and my friends recorded it, and we were looking at it last night, but I only saw a bit of it. And so, no, I'm sorry, I really don't remember how that happened. Sorry to be so dull on that one. But I do have to explain to you that, you see, that composers often don't have so many amusing stories about movies, because we always, at least I was always called in kind of late. You know, it's not like being on the floor all the time and being a director or somebody and the team was on the floor while the film is being shot. And I always wished I could move more with the actors, because I've always loved actors. I've had a lot of actor friends, and I liked working in the theatre when I had a chance. But of course, in those days with Hammer, one was called in when the film was almost finished, when they were almost to a final cut. And so that's why I don't have a great deal of stories about what actually happened.
Have you ever had a score thrown out?
No, touch wood. I better touch wood, 'cause it hasn't happened yet. And I was off the scene for 11 years when I went to live in Jamaica, but I've sort of kind of come back. I've risen from the grave, and so we shall see what happens.
Did you find it greatly different working with Bill Martell after John Hollingsworth?
Yes, it was. He was a very different personality. John was a great friend of mine, and he was a great one for giggles and laughter, which I am too. And so we always had jokes while we were doing films. And like when we came to a romantic bit of music, at last, after all the horror, he'd say, have you got your picture hat ready? You know, the sort of Gainsborough lady in the picture hat. He said, this is the picture hat bit. And so, you know, he was fun to work with and a very good friend. And once he was happy that you were doing, you'd agreed on the sort of material that you were using, he'd just leave me to get on with it. Phil, I came to know also very well, but he was a much more prickly character. He was a difficult character. I don't know quite how to describe him. He was very short, and I think often short people, I hope I'm not saying the wrong thing, but, but I think he had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, and because he really would like to have been a great concert conductor, and he had never become that. And at the time I came to work with him, he was working absolutely almost only in films. Now, John Hollingsworth had a much wider range. I mean, he used to conduct the Promenade concerts, which are still going strong, as you probably know, in London. And he was assistant to Malcolm Sargent, who was one of our great conductors of the time. He was a conductor of the Royal Ballet. And so John had lots of other things he did, and lots of other interests. But Phil lived entirely for the film music. And so he rather did tend to want to breathe down one's neck while one was composing. However, he came to know that it wouldn't be helpful if he breathed down my neck. But we maintained a very friendly relationship. But it was more difficult with him. He liked to know everything I was doing, and he liked to get the scores. As I couldn't sort of, in the early days, I liked to do all the composing first, and all my timings, and then start on the actual orchestration, which I always did myself. But Phil liked to be fed with the scores as we went along. So I'd have to write a bit, then score it, let him have it so he could see if he approved. So he wasn't so easy to work with. But I liked him immensely, and I was very fond of him. Yes.
What other composers have you found to be influences on your work?
You mean in general, or for...
Maybe some specific composers.
Yes. Well, I will tell you, as a young man, I worked for a year for Benjamin Britten. He's a very strong influence on me. I think he's one of the great composers of this century. And I came to know him while I was still at school, because it was just at the time he was doing his opera Peter Grimes, which was his first great and 2 years at the College of Music in London, the Royal College, under a wonderful composer called Herbert Howells. I went to work for Ben Britten for a year. I was thinking to myself, how the hell do I start? I don't want to teach music, and I don't think I'd be any good at it. I want to compose, but how am I to make any money from composing? And suddenly the phone went, and there was Ben Britten saying, I'm writing an opera. It's Billy Budd, which has been on again recently, both in London and at the Met in New York. And he said, would you come and work for me and simply copy out the vocal score, be my sort of dog's body? And of course it was a wonderful opportunity, because that really taught me the hard work involved in composing. So he was a great influence. Then I know are we getting towards the end of our time?
I merely leaned forward.
I thought you were making kind of signs.
No.
Oh, well.
They have other people.
But I mean, apart from him, who was a composer I knew extremely well, and William Walton I also came to know very well and admired his music greatly. But going back to older composers, I really loved romantic music, and still do. And Liszt was, I think, a big influence on me. I love the music of Liszt. And in The Kiss of the Vampire, I don't know if you know that score of mine, and there's a piano bit, a piano solo. I tried to write that like a bit of sort of rather late Liszt. And yes, Liszt is a big influence. Verdi, the opera composer, I'm a great admirer of. Tchaikovsky. I mean, they're rather obvious choices, but those are the ones and also Ravel and Debussy. Ravel very much. And some of my score for She is rather embarrassingly reminiscent of bits of Ravel's score for Daphnis and Chloe. And I just hope that it was quite unconscious, but later I did realize.
It was lost on the kids at the Lowe's Grand when I saw it. One more.
Anything else? Yes.
How did you come to write the award-winning script for 7 Days to Noon?
Oh well, that was a very strange story. Yes, because I was still a music student, and I shared a house with my great friend Paul Dehn. I don't know if you know his name, D-E-H-N, who became a well-known screenwriter. And at that stage, he was actually a critic. He was a lot older than me. He was 13 years older than me. And anyway, we shared a house together, and we used to go and stay with my mother, who lived in Cranley, which is a town about 40 miles outside London, often at the weekend. And we were driving across Waterloo Bridge. Do you know London? Well, we were driving across Waterloo Bridge, and and the weather was rather like it's been here the last few weeks. And it was a beautiful evening, and we were crossing the bridge, and everything looked lovely, the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben. And one of us said to the other, wouldn't it be terrible if all this was blown up by an atom bomb? So that was the seed of writing that story. And of course, Paul was the one who was the writer, but he hadn't become a film writer at that stage. He was a very highly regarded critic on a national newspaper called the Daily Chronicle, the News Chronicle, sorry. And so we sort of wrote the story together. We thought this would be a good film. And we wrote it together, and we had an agent, and the agent thought it was good and sold it to two directors called the Bolting brothers, who did a lot of very good films at that time. They were twin brothers. And they made it rather like a documentary. Well, you've seen the film. And then, of course, people have said to me, well, did I come out for the Oscar ceremony? Because if you remember, we each won an Oscar. And it was for a category of Oscar, which I don't think exists now, which was for the best original screen story of that year. We knew nothing about it. And in those days, the Oscars in London were not all reported on the TV like they are now. And the first thing we knew about it was seeing a headline in the Evening Standard of who the winners were. And we saw that we'd won these Oscars. And people say, did I go to a ceremony? And I say, well, you want to know what our ceremony was? It was that a man, a very charming man who represented the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in London, rang us up and said, I've got your Oscars, do you want them? And we said, yes, we would rather like them, please. Well, would you like to come and have a gin and tonic or drinks with us tomorrow night? So he arrived in a London taxi with a big cardboard box, came into our sitting room, we got out the gin and tonic and poured 3 large ones, opened the box, and out of the tissue paper came the 2 Oscars. And we said, thank you very much. He drank up his drink and went away. And that was our Oscar ceremony. But, well,
I'd like to thank our Oscar-winning composer for his time and for a lot of years of great music. And
thank you very
for those
much.
of you who are staying for the next film, it's by far one of his very best scores. It's haunting and just a great score, which is not on record. So if you have your little tape recorders with you, you can tape it. Thanks.
Thank you. My hand's sweating. Thank you very much indeed. Most grateful.
Does his own stagehand work? I like that.
Oh, well, I like to anything like that. Thank you. It's very nice, and I have admired your films very much. It's lovely to meet you. Thanks. I can be around.
Lobby, would you bring?